Hola, hello. My name is Xiomara Enid Rivera Pagan, and I'll be presenting my conceptual framework on the intersection of orientations and ideologies within educational language policies. Our objectives today will be to discuss language policy orientations and how the language used either supports or limits linguistic diversity. We'll discuss language learning ideologies, and we'll consider a relationship between educational language policy orientation and ideologies within class, school, district, or organization. And so at the end of the session, we should be able to reflect on our position within the conceptual framework, reflect on our school, district, organization's position within the framework, and also consider how we could use this conceptual framework as a tool in order to advance our discussions with decision makers in support of our multilingual students. So specifically, educational language policies are language policies, and language policies are identified by Kaplan and Baldoff as a body of ideas, laws, regulations, rules, and practices intended to achieve the planned language change within a society, group, or system. And so this can be our explicit or implicit policies. Specifically within the educational system, language planning and policies, or LPPs, are identified as educational language policies. And educational language policies, or ELPs, are especially important because they have the power within a school system to determine the access that students have to not only the languages, maintenance of home language and acquisition of second language, but also to the curriculum that leads to the content and language learning. So within the research and the literature that's currently available, oftentimes ideology and orientation, the two phrases are used interchangeably, and sometimes they are separated. And so for the purposes of this conceptual framework, we want to be very explicit about separating the two concepts, and we're going to identify and define both ideology and orientation in an effort to see how, by being explicit and separating these two concepts and then intersecting them, they have different outcomes for either language majority students, language minority students. In this particular context, we're really going to hone in on our multilingual students. So ELP ideology is, in this particular study, the belief or attitude associated with language learning and possibilities for acquiring language. And so how do people feel about either multilingualism or language acquisition? And the concept of language ideologies was initially proposed by Richard Rees in a NABE article, actually, and he identified 3 ideologies specifically that he would further explore and that has been used throughout the literature, and that is language as a problem, language as a right, and language as a resource. And then Holt and Hornberger actually further elaborated on these ideas that were initially proposed by Richard Rees in a 2016 article. And those are the definitions that we use in this particular framework. And so language as a problem is a set of values that stem from a monolingual ideal and assimilationist mindset. So they view the home language as a problem and something to be overcome in order to acquire the dominant language. Language as a right seeks to address linguistically based inequities using compensatory models mechanisms. Language as a resource is multilingualism and cultural diversity are valued and seen as fully compatible with national unity. ELP orientations are the actual directives that allow for restrictive, tolerance, expediency, or promotion orientation language learning. So when we are differentiating these two concepts, we're being very explicit that ideology, the attitudes, are the beliefs, and that the orientations are the actual actions or directives that are taken by an individual or an institution in order to promote or restrict or be tolerant of multilingualism. And so these orientations were first identified by Heinz Claus, and then the definitions that we see here were the further elaborations of Terence Wiley. And we have three big themes of orientation that are identified, starting with restrictive. Restrictive is identified as legal prohibitions or curtailments on the use of minority languages. There are age requirements dictating when a child may study a minority or foreign language. So these are the legal or implicit or explicit decisions that are made in order to restrict access, usually for our multilingual students who have a home language other than English, and they are promoting English-only practices rather than any practices that might use home language in order to access the English language. In the center's tolerance orientation, it's a weaker version of the following orientation, which is promotion. And it is intended to expand the use of minority language, but typically it's used only for short-term accommodations. And so we see a lot of this, especially within the United States, in order to access English, where we're using programs that are heavily focused on English language acquisition. There may or may not be use of home language, but really the focus is on English language acquisition. And if there's home language available, it's really limited and in an effort to build the English language acquisition. Promotion orientation is the government or state agency allocates resources to support the official use of minority languages. And so the peak of promotion orientation is when these dual language programs or two-way immersion programs are supporting our multilingual students in accessing their home language in order to maintain and add on to their linguistic repertoire with the English, and then also support our monolingual students in continuing their acquisition of their dominant language, which is English, but also adding on by valuing these other languages in order to demonstrate that there is cultural diversity and multilingual diversity in these spaces. So the peak is when languages are promoted and cultural diversity is promoted. Lesser version of promotion orientation, but still not tolerance orientation, would be expediency, where the focus is again promoting English language acquisition. There may be more use of home language than maybe in a tolerance orientation, but again, the focus is really English language acquisition. And we'll see the difference between a clear promotion orientation as identified in this conceptual framework versus an expediency orientation. And then the last orientation that Claus identifies, which is pretty important, is null policies, which are the significant absence of policy recognizing minority languages or language varieties, which is very important in terms of the United States because there are spaces in which explicit policies for language learning are not identified. And when those policies do not exist, there's opportunity to move either in a restrictive or tolerance orientation, maybe promotion orientation, but do so in an implicit way, which is a little bit harder for policy implementers and arbiters to work with. So identifying those policies and being very explicit about the orientation supports our ability to move within this spectrum towards promotion orientation and multilingual practices. So we see that when ideologies and the attitudes and beliefs come and intersect with the orientation and the opportunities for orientation, they have certain outcomes that might look different, especially for our multilingual students. And so the idea behind this conceptual framework is to explore how those ideologies and orientations manifest into certain outcomes in order to identify where we as individuals or our system is, and then move towards more supportive practices for our multilingual students. So at the top left, you'll see problem and promotion orientation, and we'll explore these further in the next couple of slides. Right underneath it is problem and restrictive. To the right of that is resource and restrictive. And then right at the top hand corner is resource and promotion. And so the left bottom corner is probably the most problematic in terms of languages being viewed as a problem and access to language is being restricted, versus the top right hand corner, which is language is viewed as a resource and language and multilingualism is being promoted. And so the idea behind this conceptual framework is not to identify which quadrant you fall in, but rather to consider the framework as a spectrum and kind of place yourself or your educational institution within the framework to see how you can move towards a resource and promotion orientation. Further exploring these ideological orientations are problem and restrictive orientation, languages viewed through a deficit lens, and opportunities for EL students are limited by opportunities through legal prohibitions, lack of resources, and exclusion from participation until language proficiency is achieved. This is that English-only movement, the Prop 227, the limited access for multilingual students. It's not as prevalent, but it is important to identify that this ideological orientation is the most problematic for our multilingual students, as it is the most limiting for them. Moving towards promotion orientation, but still viewing language as a problem, home language as a problem, it starts to get us into that expediency orientation. So language is viewed through a deficit lens, and opportunities for EL students are believed to be achieved through assimilationist mindset. And so this is that concept of more English or more time on task, or learn English first to then go back and remember your home language, is the goal, where English first, and then you can potentially add on, which we know is very problematic in terms of maintaining home language and in also accessing that second language. Moving towards language as a resource orientation, but still with that restrictive orientation, is this concept of multilingualism is viewed as an enrichment opportunity without consideration for the systemic inequities and how language learning programs are implemented and who is benefiting from them. So this goes into the concept of dual language gentrification and these dual language programming being placed in spaces that really are geared towards monolingual students, or languages that don't have language models because the majority of the students are English dominant and they don't have the opportunity to amplify multilingual students' abilities, or the seal of biliteracy, which was initially intended to support multilingual students in amplifying their linguistic resources and their cultural diversity and the abilities that they already had, and instead often are geared towards students to further enhance their assets. And so when we consider how does this specifically support our multilingual students, and if it doesn't, then that would be the language as a resource restrictive orientation. And finally, resource and promotion orientation. This is where we're truly valuing all of our language learners. We're capitalizing on the multilingual students' abilities, and we're also supporting our monolingual students by using our multilingual students as the language models. So multilingualism and cultural diversity are prioritized throughout programs in an effort to capitalize on the language abilities of linguistic minorities and advance their opportunity through additive multilingualism. So there's a strong consideration on which programs benefit which groups, and it's considered to increase linguistic and cultural equity. So this is when we're being very thoughtful about putting our dual language programs or our SIOP programs and fostering those home languages in order to access that second language, building on our students' multilingual abilities through additive practices rather than subtractive. And right and tolerance orientation, that's the center of the conceptual framework, which we see does honor the fact that students have language, the right to access that language, but usually if it's tolerance and right, the consideration is more of language as a right to access English versus language as a right and promotion would be language as a right to access English and maintain home language. So this tolerance orientation really just upholds the most minimal of language rights. It really does not advance the local education agencies or the state education agencies to improve equitable access for multilingual students. It is creating that space to learn English, not foster the home language. So how do I use this? What questions should I be asking? This is a framework, as mentioned, that you can have a conversation around with your team, your school, as an individual in order to reflect what beliefs and attitudes a person or an organization has, and then the space that the institution or the district can give you in promoting multilingualism. And so the more that a policy, an ELP, an educational language policy, is explicit in orienting towards promotion or multilingualism, the more likely that policy arbiters have the agency to then promote the language and view it through a right or a resource ideology. And so identifying explicit policy is very key. And then once you identify the explicit policy, you can start to consider the orientations as specified in this particular conceptual framework. And then noticing what language you're using and amplifying within the educational language policy. If you're seeing that there is a lot of reference and explicit mention of English, and not as much of multilingualism, bilingualism, bicultural practices, then that demonstrates an orientation, maybe tolerance orientation versus a promotion orientation, where there's an explicit acknowledgement of multilingual practices and how those multilingual practices will be done throughout the educational system in order to support your multilingual students. And so considering these questions in order to reflect on the conceptual framework would be supportive. Perhaps using this conceptual framework in order to reflect as an individual or reflect as a team in order to identify how you, perhaps maybe your beliefs or language as a resource, but the actions that you have been taking, either because of the institution or because of the resources, have been more limited. So working to identify exactly what it is in terms of ideology or the orientation that your school system needs to improve on in order to support our multilingual students. So suggestions from here are to locate explicit policy. You can do this in the Board of Education or in your local school system. If you don't have an explicit policy, maybe consider proposing an explicit policy, and then evaluating using the conceptual framework in order to identify what practices you can do in order to promote multilingualism, and then supporting staff in shifting ideology towards language as a right or language as a resource, but really promotion orientation to promote multilingual practices. And then repeat, because this is a framework that can constantly be revisited, because this is a spectrum that we can constantly improve in order to get better support our multilingual students. So again, my name is Xiomara Eni Rivera Pagan. My email is here, and I would love to hear from you all on how you have reflected on these educational language policies and the conceptual framework of orientations and ideologies within educational language policies. If you have any questions, let me know. Thank you so much for your time. Have a wonderful day.